a humble employee of the Burlington Northern Santa Fe Railroad, was diagnosed with CTS, or carpal tunnel syndrome, which is a nerve disorder that afflicts the hands and forearms with pain, numbness, and tingling. He underwent surgery and took some leave in order to recover. Upon returning to work, Gary's employer told him that he would have to submit to mandatory genetic testing, or else he'd be fired. When Gary refused to submit to the testing, his employer proceeded to take steps towards firing him. Gary sought help from his union and the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, which was able to win a suit against Burlington Northern and get Gary his job back. Gary later found out that his employer had been conducting secret genetic tests on their employees in hopes to uncover predispositions to CTS as a defense against workers' compensation claims. What the Santa Fe Railroad Company did to Mr. Avery was a direct violation of his rights under the Constitution. After the lawsuit, Gary said the following: "No one can help how they're put together. Only God knows that. Your employer, insurance provider, or anyone else has no business of that knowledge." Gary got lucky in that his story was heard and he was able to keep his job. But nonetheless, the threat of genetic discrimination is real, and Americans deserve justice. The amount of information that can be told about a person simply by looking at their genome is incredibly extensive. You've probably heard of the genetic testing company called 23andMe. Currently, this company sells its personal ancestry kit for as low as $49. The kit can tell you where your DNA is from, what regions of the world your ancestry came from, and even specific people or people groups you're related to from 1,000 or more years ago. However, the company has been shifting its marketing from an ancestry tool to a medical tool. The company's $200 health and ancestry kit can tell you whether you have genetic markers which correlate to certain health conditions. The test can warn you about a susceptibility to Parkinson's, late-onset Alzheimer's, celiac disease, and many more. The information that can be gained from these tests is so specific that, for example, if a particular site in your genome, named RS104-27255, is present, you're likely to sneeze when exposed to bright light. Additionally, the presence of site RS178-22931 can even indicate if a person will have dry earwax. Although genetic testing is a powerful tool, when it comes to predicting medical conditions, it does not have the ability to accurately predict whether or not a person will for sure develop a disorder. Genetic testing can only pick up on markers of a disorder, which can be used to indicate an increase in their susceptibility, however, with little accuracy. With the access to endless information about the genome, the threat of genetic discrimination becomes more menacing. The pure definition of genetic discrimination is the use of information about a person's genome to treat them unfairly because they have or are predicted to have gene mutations which could cause them to have an increased likelihood of developing an inherited disorder. The threatening issue is that your employer or insurance provider could discriminate you based solely on your increased likelihood to developing a disorder. Like I said before, although genetic testing technology such as 23andMe is powerful, it can only make predictions based on probability. So when someone experiences genetic discrimination, they're really being unfairly judged based on their increased likelihood to developing a disorder, when oftentimes the person may never develop the disorder. On May 21st, 2008, President George W. Bush signed the Genetic Information Non-Discrimination Act, or GINA, into place, which effectively banned the use of personal genetic information by employers and insurance providers to discriminate. Title I of the law prohibits insurance providers from charging higher premiums or even denying coverage to applicants with predispositions to threatening medical conditions. Furthermore, Title II of the law was described to ensure that employers could not use genetic information as part of the deciding process for hiring, firing, or promoting an individual. GINA effectively protects Americans from the threat of genetic discrimination. However, recently, a new proposition on the table, known as House Resolution, or HR 1313, has been creating much concern, undermining the restrictions of GINA and putting Americans back at risk for genetic discrimination. HR 1313 would essentially act as a loophole in GINA. The bill would exempt employee wellness programs from the limitations of GINA and the Americans with Disabilities Act of 1990 by essentially allowing them to collect genetic information from the employee or employee's family members. Wellness programs are put in place by employers to improve the health of their employees. They offer additional help such as diet information and exercise plans. However, the real benefit of these programs is their ability to lower healthcare costs for employers. Currently, wellness programs are not allowed to ask for genetic information from their participants. However, HR 1313 would allow them to require this information. The reason why H.R. 1313 claims to be legal under GINA and the Americans with Disabilities Act is that participation in a wellness program is meant to be voluntary. It seems as though the very word voluntary would make this a moot argument. If the people are joining the wellness programs on their own free will, then it's okay, right? To answer this, I'll refer to the words of Judy G. Russell, a professional genealogist with a law degree. She said, "The proposed bill H.R. 1313 allows employers to penalize employees who don't fully participate in the wellness plans up to 50% of the cost of employer-provided insurance. And to fully participate, an employee has to hand over all types of information which GINA says can't be required, can't be used, can't be considered by an employer." Additionally, GINA states that the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission regulations do not allow employers to offer any type of financial incentives to induce their employees to provide genetic information. In theory, these wellness plans are meant to be voluntary, but when the employer is given the right to charge up to 50% more when the employee keeps their genetics private, in Russell's words, the notion of voluntariness pretty much goes out the window. Companies should not be allowed to take their employees' genetic information under the jurisdiction of wellness programs or assign cash penalties to employees who opt out of the wellness programs. For this to happen, legislators should vote against the proposed bill H.R. 1313. H.R. 1313 would be detrimental to employees' privacy and would violate human rights for three primary reasons. The first would be the increased risk of employee discrimination that the bill creates. Secondly, the bill would widen racial gaps in employment due to the fact that certain racial and ethnic groups experience a higher susceptibility to particular medical disorders. Lastly, H.R. 1313 is unconstitutional and violates the Fourth Amendment by essentially allowing for the unjust seizure of personal private property. Before GINA, the threat of genetic discrimination was menacing. There have been countless cases of employees and their family members being denied coverage under their work-related health insurance plans. In 1982, the federal government conducted a survey and found that only 1.6% of companies used genetic testing on their willing employees. Just 15 years later, a similar study done by the American Management Association found that this percentage had gone up to between 6 and 10%. Moreover, in a survey reflected in Lisa N. Geller's book, Individual, Family, and Social Dimensions of Genetic Discrimination, out of 1,000 people who were at risk for genetic disorders, 22% claimed to have received some type of discrimination based solely on their susceptibility to the disorder. In an abstract written by professional genealogist J.C. Fletcher, 550 people in a survey of primary care physicians, genetic counselors, and patients reported that they were blatantly denied employment or insurance based solely on their susceptibility to a threatening disorder. These cases were a direct result of employers' use of predictive genetic testing to root out employees whose genetic imperfections portrayed them as liabilities. The issue here goes back to the inaccuracy of genetic testing. A good example of this is Alzheimer's. When testing for a predisposition to Alzheimer's, measurement of the genetic marker E can indicate an increase in the risk of people from European descent. However, 2/3 of the time when this marker is present, the person will have a 10-fold increase, while 1/3 of the time, the risk is only 2-fold. Because of this drastic unpredictability, a test that comes back positive for a predisposition to Alzheimer's is essentially incapable of accurately predicting anything at all. This information could be potentially dangerous if it were to get into the hands of an employer or an insurance provider. Seeing that one of their employees has a positive predisposition to Alzheimer's, an employer could make the unfair and inaccurate assumption that they will definitely develop a disorder and simply choose to fire them. As Mark A. Hall wrote in his book, Jurometrics, on the appropriate uses of genetic information, it is fundamentally unfair and morally wrong to penalize people based on their bad luck in the genetic lottery, especially considering that no one is responsible for their genetic heritage. The argument for the passage of H.R. 1313 is being fought over a desire to save money, but it comes at the cost of human rights. Thankfully, in 2008, GINA put a stop to all this. The protection that GINA offers Americans is incredibly relieving. We now have laws put in place to protect us from the threat of being fired based on our genes. However, because of its disguise of being under these so-called voluntary wellness programs, H.R. 1313 has the potential to bring back all the old threats of genetic discrimination. By undermining the restrictions of GINA, H.R. 1313 would force Americans back into a state of vulnerability where our employment status was dependent on our genetic serendipity. Along with the risk of employee discrimination, H.R. 1313 has the potential to widen racial gaps in employment due to the fact that certain disorders are more prevalent amongst certain racial and ethnic groups. A prime example of this is sickle cell anemia and its relation to African Americans. According to a Michigan State University study done in July of 2014, only about 2 in every 1,000 white Americans suffers from sickle cell anemia, whereas almost 300 out of every 1,000 African Americans do. In the early 1970s, 12 states ordered laws that would direct mandatory sickle cell anemia testing on African Americans simply due to their higher susceptibility to the disorder. This meant that before being allowed to attend school, get a job, or apply for insurance, African Americans would have to submit to mandatory genetic testing to make sure they did not have the disorder. The issue became so out of hand, in fact, that in 1972, President Nixon passed the National Sickle Cell Anemia Control Act, which effectively required that screening for sickle cell on African Americans be optional. Sadly, however, even after this act was passed, the discrimination continued. Throughout the 1970s, even perfectly healthy African Americans were denied employment, insurance, and educational opportunities simply due to the assumption that they were carriers of the disorder. This case proves that genetic testing has the potential to cause racial segregation in the workforce. By bringing back all the old threats of genetic discrimination, H.R. 1313 could effectively cause similar results as the sickle cell testing in the 70s. Another example of how H.R. 1313 could discriminate has to do with breast cancer. The average woman in the United States has about a 12% chance of developing breast cancer in her life. According to Leah Center, a licensed medical professional at the Ohio State University Medical Lab, only about 1 out of every 800 individuals of the non-Ashkenazi Jewish background has one of the founding genetic mutations of breast cancer, BRCA1 or BRCA2, whereas an alarming 1 in 40 Ashkenazi Jews has one of these mutations. By applying the same theory of what happened with African Americans in the 70s, we see how the use of predictive genetic testing could force yet another people group out of the workforce. This stresses the importance of keeping your genetics private and safe from employer and insurance provider discrimination. By making your highly personal genetic information more accessible to employers, H.R. 1313 would cause unnecessary segregation. This day and age, along with the rapid progression of technology, our constitutional rights are challenged on multiple fronts. If H.R. 1313 were to pass, it would only contribute to this digression. The Fourth Amendment to the United States Constitution says that the right of the people to be secure in their persons, houses, papers, and effects against unreasonable searches and seizures shall not be violated. The important thing to understand here is that our genetics are the single most personal thing we have. Because the demands of H.R. 1313 would allow employers to take this information, it would violate the Fourth Amendment. In 1998, the federal court case Norman Bloodsaw versus Lawrence Berkeley Laboratories confirmed that taking someone's DNA violates the Fourth Amendment. Additionally, it became the first federal court case to recognize the constitutional right to genetic privacy in the workforce. The case came to court because Lawrence Berkeley Labs had been conducting secret genetic tests on its employees. The court ruled the following: the most basic violation possible of constitutional privacy interests involves the performance of unauthorized testing for medical information, and that such testing may be viewed as a legal search under the Fourth Amendment, in addition to violation of due process under the Fifth and 14th Amendments, because there are few subject areas more personal and more likely to implicate privacy interests than that of one's health or genetic makeup. The reason this relates to H.R. 1313 is because the bill would allow for the dangers of genetic discrimination to come back, putting Americans back in danger. Once again, because H.R. 1313 would allow employers to assign cash penalties to employees who opt out of wellness programs, the majority of Americans will want to participate in them. Concurrently, the majority of Americans are completely unaware of the privacy implications that go along with genetic testing. This is fundamentally why H.R. 1313 is crooked. It essentially relies on Americans' ignorance of the dangers of genetic testing to benefit and lower healthcare costs for employers. Now, you might be asking yourself what the potential benefits of H.R. 1313 could be. This requires some quick backstory on the effectiveness of workplace wellness plans. Remember, workplace wellness programs are proven to lower healthcare costs for employers. The company Johnson & Johnson has saved a total of $250 million in the past decade as a direct result of using wellness programs. The company's average return on the wellness plans was about $3 for every dollar spent. This introduces the next step. If Johnson & Johnson can save this much money with just your average wellness program, imagine how much they could save if they had the ability to see into each and every one of their participants' genomes and prescribe personal, explicit health plans with a simple swab of the cheek. The reason, however, why this isn't just a simple greater than, less than problem goes back to what I said earlier about the accuracy of genetic testing. A diagnostics company called Ambry Genetics analyzed the results from 49 different patients' direct-to-consumer predictive genetic tests. They found that an astonishing 40% of the results from these tests were what's known as false positives. This means that 40% of the time, the test indicated that the person had a specific genetic variant, which is not actually there. If HR 1313 were to pass, it would allow employers to perform this style of genetic testing on their employees. Although genetic testing would allow employers to gain a slightly more comprehensive view of their employees' health, the point I'm making is simple. Because the tests have been proven to be fairly inaccurate and there is little health benefit to be gained, it's completely absurd to undermine Americans' constitutional rights and put them in danger of genetic discrimination. The subtle benefit of genetic testing would come at the tremendous cost of our privacy. When addressing the issues of HR 1313, it is important to remember which is more valuable, money or freedom. The threat of genetic discrimination is scary and real. HR 1313 poses a serious threat to employers' privacy and should be stopped. Because HR 1313 would increase the risk of genetic discrimination, it would effectively endanger employees, cause racial segregation, and rob us of our constitutional rights under the Fourth Amendment. When it's all said and done, the issues over HR 1313 are between money and privacy. The ones pushing for the passage of HR 1313 are trying to cut their expenses on the health care that they must provide for their employees, at the cost of their employees' privacy. The employee only sees the other end of this trade-off. While companies would reap the benefits of cheaper health care costs, employees would suffer the consequences of having their genetics exploited to where they no longer have the shelter of privacy. It's up to each and every one of you to know your constitutional rights so that threats like HR 1313 aren't allowed to subtly gain control. Additionally, every American should understand the privacy risks that come with genetic testing so that companies aren't free to just take the very information that defines us as individuals. Thank you. Thanks.
Okay. On William's panel, we have Rodney Bowling, who has his PhD in medicine and medical research he got it from Texas A&M. He's the director of molecular genetics at X Biotech, and his DNA was number 57 on the human genome list. That is a true thing, number 57. It's cool. All right, Brandon Thompson is returning from our first thesis. He's a private practice physician specializing in anesthesiology and pain medicine. He has his MD from University of Texas with a BA in Bible and Biblical Languages from Southwest Baptist University. He also coaches SR&SL soccer here at Veritas Academy. We also have Melanie Eloquin, who was Will's advisor. She's completing her 11th year at Veritas Academy, where she has instructed 8th American History and AP American History, I think among some other things over the years. She currently serves as Dean of Academics for the Schools of Logic and Rhetoric, and she is my boss. She attended Stanford University on a debate scholarship and truly enjoys policy questions and the research that surrounds the topics that are presented as part of the thesis program. She and Scott have 2 sons who graduated from Veritas Academy and participated in the senior thesis program. We also have Graham Donaldson, who is head of the thesis department here at Veritas Academy and a staple on the panels. He is also my boss. So, you know, as you're judging them, they're also judging me, which is important. His DNA comes from Canada, where they have several genetic markers, those for affability, rugged in, intense weather, and dry earwax, apparently. So, Welcome, folks. You have a paddle in front of you. If you have a new question, show me the white side. If you have a follow-up question, show me the red side, and I can prioritize you. So the floor is open.
Okay. Good job, Will.
Thank you.
So you open with a very compelling story about a gentleman named Gary Avery and carpal tunnel syndrome. I was just curious if this has ever happened to anyone else, any specific examples that you read other than Gary Avery?
Right. So probably one of the more compelling stories that I ran across that I was unable to include in my paper was a sixth grader named Coleman Chatham, and he went to school in Palo Alto, California. And long story short, he had a genetic marker to cystic fibrosis, and the school found out about this because the parent had filled out a survey and included it in the health survey. And essentially, the kid was forced to leave his school, where he'd already made friends and already kind of established a foundation, just because of this genetic marker which he had to CF. And I guess it's important to note that he did not have CF, and he never got CF. But because there was another kid in the school who had CF, he was forced to leave. And although it's not a workplace issue, I believe it highlights the dangers that genetic discrimination bring, because clearly, although he didn't have a disorder, he was still discriminated because of his genetics.
Good job, William.
Thank you.
All right, let's talk insurance companies for a second. So in your presentation, you mentioned that if you don't take part in the workplace, it was like a 50% higher fee. And the way you presented it sounded like that was a punitive thing. But if I'm an insurance company, I price all of my plans based on probability. If I know absolutely nothing about you, I'm going to make you pay me more money for the plan. And if I know every little thing, if I can see into your future, I can time travel, I will be able to perfectly price out what I'm looking for. So doesn't it make sense that people who withhold information will logically have higher premiums? It's not a punitive thing. It's just a reality of the improbability of trying to price out these plans. So I guess I'm just sort of curious as to why you think that this is like you're still giving people the choice to be able to trade off between giving up my genetic privacy for a cheaper plan or not giving up my genetic privacy but having to go with a more expensive plan because the insurance companies don't know how to price me as well.
Right. So there's a distinction between the employer discrimination and the health provider discrimination. So I guess to sort of answer your question, so right now, HR 1313 only applies to employers because it allows the wellness plans to ask for your information. So let me know if this answers your question, but basically, even now, health insurance providers are not allowed to see your genetics. So that's the way things work nowadays. But with this threat of genetic discrimination, it's basically people with these threatening conditions. It's sort of unfair to make just them have to pay the higher premiums, whereas everyone has the right to withhold their genetic information, and because it's private property. And so the sort of backbone of my argument is that it's been established that it is unjust for employers and insurance providers to sort of see this information beforehand without your consent. But HR 1313 makes it easier for this to happen. So therefore, we should vote against it because it would, yeah.
Follow up.
So one thing, just thinking about this, about the insurance companies and deciding risk for people and what premiums they should charge seems like a fair question, but how accurate is the genetic testing? Would it indicate that I have a marker and I might actually get the disease, or Could that be wrong, and therefore I'm paying higher premiums for something I will never get?
Right. So as I addressed in the paper, the reason why we don't want these insurance companies or employers to be using genetic testing is because it is highly inaccurate. One of the statistics I mentioned said that they found that 40% of the results from these, they're called predictive genetic tests, were inaccurate. So everyone has markers to certain disorders, but that does not necessarily mean they will develop them. So I'm sure I have markers to, certain health conditions or you name it, but that doesn't mean I'm ever going to get it. And so if the employers and insurance providers base their premium rating off of these tests, it is not an accurate depiction of the employee's health. So therefore, it shouldn't be used.
There's a claim to be made, though, that these tests will be significantly more accurate the more data we collect. What's your answer to that?
Right. So even as the accuracy goes up throughout time, it still brings up this issue of you own your genetics, and therefore an employer or an insurance provider, regardless of how accurate the tests they're doing are, they still should not be allowed to even see this information. Because so even if your employer gets a hold of your genetics and they never choose to discriminate you, the pure fact that they can see that violates your privacy. Does that answer your question? Okay.
So on a completely different topic,
For sure.
You mentioned blood testing for sickle cell disease in the late 70s.
Mhm.
That was actually born out of a different idea. During the late 50s, we started testing blood for venereal disease prior to getting married as part of the marriage license.
Okay.
Obviously, one of the logical outcomes of getting married is children. And they were finding that as sickle cell disease is a homozygous recessive trait, 1/4 of those children would be born and be very sick and die a very nasty death. That was one of the impetus for pushing for that. In my case, I did give my DNA for genome sequencing, but it was anonymously. So I absolutely agree with you that it needs to remain anonymous. But to keep it away from the employer, I agree. But I believe that there is a place for compulsory DNA testing.
Okay.
In my case, I was selected because I carry a trait for beta thalassemia. You have Mediterranean on the south side, you have sickle cell disease, and on the north side, you have thalassemia. I knew this going into being married, but perhaps if my wife, and we tested my wife because of this before we got married, but it would be easy for me to have missed that, and we could have children with long-lasting, horrible ramifications. Do you object to compulsory testing, period?
So compulsory testing as in separate from workplace
Separate from the employer.
and health provider? So personally, I think that kind of comes down to the person individually. With doing any sort of genetic test, you immediately create the risk that your information, having been read, will be taken and distributed to people who might necessarily not want to be able to see that. I wouldn't object to any sort of law prohibiting that, because that comes down to the decision of the individual. But so as regards to the employer issue, though, when it comes down to having to pay more to not provide your genetics, that's where the issue, I believe, arises.
Right.
Can I follow up very quickly?
Real fast. And then Donaldson also has a follow-up. Sorry, we'll get to you, I promise.
But in this case, I'm talking about a child that will be born that could have been saved misery and trouble had we had genetic testing going into that marriage.
Thank you.
Am I allowed to respond to that? Or? Okay, you're saying they could have avoided misery.
If my wife carried the thalassemia trait,
For sure.
1/4 of my children would die a nasty death prior to being a teenager. So, sickle cell, same idea. In testing for that sickle cell disease in both parents, you could say this is not a good match because of this.
Right.
Do you see a value in that?
So.
And does the value outweigh the risk of release of that data?
So if you take the test then, and you saw that if your wife had that, would you have chosen to not conceive children, or is that what you're saying? Like to spare them from the having to go through life with this disorder? To that I would say, personally, I'd rather live with a disorder than not live at all. And I think if this is the issue you're addressing, of course, we should make these genetic tests accessible to people who want to avoid that. But there should be no sort of laws put in place to force people to do it or to, in this case, prevent people from doing it. Because there is definitely a lot of potential for genetic testing. I don't mean to disregard that. So.
Sorry, Brandon. Yeah, one last little follow-up on this line of questioning before we move on.
And then Brandon gets like 6 questions.
Yeah. Is there a way, so let's say that if we could have if people were genetically tested, but it was not tied to their personal identity, so we have a big batch of DNA in an area, but we don't know who the DNA belongs to, is there still not a benefit to say like, oh look, in this region of the country we're having some sort of a genetic marker that is disproportionately spiking throughout the rest of the region. Maybe there's something weird going on in the water or whatever. But the companies don't know, like line by line, person by person. They have a big pool of metadata. Would that first of all get over your third point, which is the Fourth Amendment constitutional rights? They don't have the data for the individual person, and is there not value in having metadata as opposed to individualized data?
Right. So there is definitely a benefit to that. In fact, in my research, I came across 23andMe is actually doing that very thing. They've been with the person's consent, obviously. They've been pooling all of this genetic information and sending it to a diagnostics company in the UK, and they've been using that to make tremendous breakthroughs with certain health problems. And so there's definitely a huge potential to that. However, in that case of 23andMe, every person who sent their genetics, they gave full consent to that. And so hopefully they were aware of the risks, but that was all up to them. And personally, I wouldn't do that just because in writing this, I've become aware of the tremendous risk that genetic discrimination can cause. However, there is a lot of potential benefit for that. Does that answer your question? Yes. Okay.
So just to kind of change directions a little bit, in your research, did you notice any international healthcare policy or laws, specifically with regard to countries that have single-payer healthcare insurers, such as government insurance? Did you happen to know whether or not compulsory genetic testing is done in these countries?
So I ran across an article that was discussing how, actually in Hong Kong, the government, I'm not actually sure about their health care over there. I'm not sure if that's exactly how that works in relation to our health care, but the Hong Kong government they also have laws put in place to prevent genetic discrimination. And so that was one research point I ran across, but this is definitely not just a thing that's happening in the United States. It's all over the world. Does that answer your question accurately? Okay.
And my follow-up question is, GINA,
right.
which you said that George Bush acted, is this just to protect against testing, or does this protect against acting on the results of the test on behalf of the insurance company or the employer?
Yes, so this is to prevent the acting on the test. So testing for genetic information is perfectly legal as long as consent is given. And all GINA does is it prevents employers and insurance providers from using that information as part of these deciding processes for making decisions. So, for example, if someone were applying to work at a company, that employer is not allowed to ask them about their genetics to alter the decision they would make on either hiring them or not. That's illegal under GINA. However, genetic testing, that happens all the time in hospitals, and like 23andMe, I'm sure people in this room have even done that, and that's perfectly legal.
Okay, let's switch gears and talk about the violation of privacy. The court case that you cited said that it was a violation of unauthorized testing against their will was the violation of the most basic guarantees that we have. So can you explain how that court case applies to your case, since it's not against their will, this is testing that they're doing related to the increased cost of health insurance?
Okay. This is essentially a two-part answer. So the court case determined that unauthorized testing for genetic information violates the Fourth Amendment. And so you're probably saying, like, okay, these people, they join the wellness programs. When they do that, they have to sign a form or however it works to where they give the authorization for them to use the information. And so the sneaky thing is, though, and the reason why this HR 1313 hasn't been completely shot down is because, so what I said earlier is, in GINA, GINA prohibits anyone or companies from charging these higher premiums to employers who don't want to provide their genetic information. So I ran across a statistic in my research, and so this news article wrote that if HR 1313 were to pass, sorry, this is a little scattered, but an employee who opted out of the wellness programs to keep their genetics private, they would, on average, have to spend an extra of $5,400 a year on their health insurance, simply because HR 1313 allows the employers to alter the rates based on the wellness program. So on the surface level, it looks like that's not related to genetic testing. So, but in them allowing to change the rates based on if you're in the wellness program or not, and then within the wellness program, them being allowed to record your genetics, those two together definitely violates the Fourth Amendment.
So William, so part of your argument was that with this information out there, employers could have incentive to terminate employment. But in the story you gave us with Mr. Avery, I mean, he was protected. He had a union, and then he had a lawsuit. I guess, why do you think that this is going to have any greater likelihood of, or do you not agree that that laws against wrongful terminations are not enough to sort of to stop this? Shouldn't we just trust the institutions that we have, even though this is a new thing?
Right. So you're saying, shouldn't we kind of let it happen and trust that the laws would prohibit anything with?
I'm saying I buy the argument about insurance.
Okay.
But part of your argument was saying that employers may now have an incentive or have an extra sort of bullet point on the con list of keeping you around. Don't we have? Should we not trust in the laws that we already have about wrongful termination, and especially maybe even with the Americans with the Disabilities Act?
Right. So the danger here is, so in case you weren't aware, the wellness programs are separate. They're supposed to be separate from the actual company. Wellness programs are not under the regulations of HIPAA, and so this would allow HR 1313 on the surface to be okay. But however, just this idea that an organization would be able to take this genetic information from their participants the chance that information will be transferred to and from the wellness program and the company it's too great of a chance to take when the ramifications would clearly outweigh the worth of taking that chance.
All right. Thank you, Will. Good job. All right, we'll be back here